My wife's secret family was exposed at our vow renewal by her own mother. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. My mother-in-law tapped the microphone, looked at my wife in her white dress, and said, "He deserves to know about the boy." The sharp feedback from the speakers shrieked through the high-end botanical garden, cutting through the heavy scent of crushed orchids and expensive champagne. I stood absolutely frozen at the altar, the afternoon sun beating down on my tailored black tuxedo. I am Mark. I'm a 35-year-old structural engineer. My entire life is built on precision, load-bearing walls, and calculating unbreakable foundations. Today was supposed to be the ultimate reinforcement of my 10-year marriage to Chloe. We had spent nearly $40,000 on this lavish, picturesque vow renewal. 200 guests were seated in perfectly aligned white wooden chairs on the lawn, staring up at us. My brother, Dave, stood just 2 feet behind me, shifting his weight uneasily on the manicured grass. Chloe looked absolutely angelic. She wore a custom silk gown that caught the summer breeze, her blonde hair pinned back flawlessly. But right now, she was staring at her mother, Helen, with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Helen didn't look terrified. She looked like a grim executioner. She stood at the podium where our officiant had been standing just moments before to deliver a blessing. In her shaking right hand, she held a thick, tightly sealed manila envelope. The edges were battered and wrinkled, like she had been gripping it in a death squeeze for days. The silence in the garden was absolute and suffocating. You could hear the water trickling from the stone fountain 50 yards away. I looked from Chloe's pale, trembling lips to Helen's steely, red-rimmed eyes. How many times can you look at the people you love before you realize they are complete strangers? Helen stepped down from the wooden podium, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth, and walked directly toward me. She didn't look at her daughter again. She extended her hand, pushing the thick paper against my chest. The envelope felt unnaturally heavy, dense with toxic secrets that had been hidden right under my own roof. I reached out and took the heavy envelope that would destroy my entire life. To understand the sheer devastation of that moment, you have to look back at the flawless blueprint of our 10-year marriage. Chloe was a regional director for a massive corporate consulting firm. Her job demanded intense focus and a punishing travel schedule. She was on the road for at least 15 days out of every month, flying between regional offices, sleeping in generic hotel rooms, and dining with corporate clients. I never questioned it. I spent my days drafting architectural plans and my evenings reviewing blueprints in our quiet, meticulously organized suburban home. Our routine was incredibly stable, or so I believed. When she came home, she was fully present. She would drop her heavy leather weekend bag by the front door, kick off her heels, and pour us both a glass of expensive red wine. We were the couple our friends envied. We didn't have children, a decision she claimed was due to her demanding career trajectory. I supported her ambition completely. But about 8 months ago, her behavior shifted. She became utterly obsessed with planning a lavish 10-year vow renewal. She didn't just want a small backyard barbecue. She wanted a massive, catered event at the city's most expensive botanical garden. She spent hours obsessing over floral arrangements, custom invitations, and string quartets. At the time, I thought it was her way of compensating for her constant absence. I thought she was trying to build a beautiful memory for us to anchor our marriage. I would sit at the kitchen island, watching her frantically tap on her iPad, organizing seating charts with a strange, almost manic desperation in her eyes. I gladly signed the checks, thinking I was investing in our shared future. I loved my wife fiercely, and I wanted to give her the grand romantic gesture she was begging for. I was entirely blind to the rotting foundation beneath my feet. I had no idea she was building a magnificent monument to hide her own massive guilt. The first glitch in our perfect reality happened 3 months before the ceremony. It was a mundane Saturday morning, and Chloe was supposedly in Seattle for a 3-day strategy conference. She had texted me from the airport, complaining about the rain. I was cleaning out the garage, organizing my tool bench, when I realized I needed the registration papers from the glove compartment of her SUV. She had taken an Uber to the airport and left her car parked in our driveway. I opened the passenger door, leaning across the leather seats, and popped open the glove box. A crumpled piece of paper fell onto the floor mat. I picked it up, smoothing out the wrinkles. It was a receipt dated the previous afternoon, but it wasn't from Seattle. It was from a local pharmacy in Portland, Oregon, a city 3 hours south of us. The items listed made my chest tighten. Children's ibuprofen, berry flavor. Dino Bites multivitamins. 1 plush stuffed bear. My hand stopped moving. How many times can you look at a receipt before you admit your life is a lie? I stood in the driveway, the paper trembling in my grip. When Chloe returned home 2 days later, I placed the receipt on the kitchen counter. I didn't yell. I just pointed to it. She didn't even flinch. She picked it up, sighed heavily, and rubbed her temples. Oh God, Mark, I'm so sorry. I had to do a last-minute site visit at the Portland branch yesterday. My pregnant coworker, Sarah, had a massive migraine, so I ran to the pharmacy for her kids before my flight to Seattle. I was so exhausted I forgot to mention it. Her voice was calm, steady, and practically dripping with exhaustion. She leaned her head against my chest, wrapping her arms around my waist. The explanation was incredibly fluid. She didn't stutter or break eye contact. She smoothed over the structural crack with absolute, terrifying perfection. She smiled so flawlessly, but my architect brain couldn't stop analyzing the hidden structural flaw. Helen, my mother-in-law, flew into town 4 days before the vow renewal. She was a rigid, sharp-tongued woman who usually treated Chloe like a prized trophy. But the moment I picked her up from the airport baggage claim, the air between them was incredibly thick and suffocating. Helen practically threw her suitcase into the trunk of my car, refusing to make eye contact with her daughter. When we arrived back at our house, the tension became unbearable. Chloe tried to show her mother the expensive silk table runners we had ordered for the reception. Helen just stared at the fabric, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. "It's very expensive, Chloe," Helen said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "I just hope you can afford the real cost of this little performance." Chloe physically flinched, dropping the silk onto the dining table. I watched them closely, feeling a cold knot forming in my stomach. Later that evening, I was pouring a glass of water in the kitchen when Helen walked in. She looked exhausted, the skin around her eyes deeply lined and bruised with lack of sleep. She stood by the marble counter, staring at me with a look of profound, agonizing pity. "You're a good man, Mark," she whispered, tracing the rim of a water glass with her trembling finger. "You build things to last. You trust the materials you use." I asked her what she meant, why she was acting so hostile toward Chloe. Helen just shook her head, tears welling up in her sharp eyes. "Blind loyalty is a dangerous thing for an observant man," she muttered, turning away from me. She walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing alone in the quiet house. My hands gripped the edges of the counter until my knuckles turned completely white. Something was fundamentally broken in my home, and the cracks were rapidly spreading across the walls. I couldn't just stand there and wait for the ceiling to finally collapse on me. The breaking point occurred 2 nights before the ceremony. Chloe was in the master bathroom, running the shower water on high. She had just returned from a final 2-day corporate sprint to supposedly finalize her quarter-end reports. Her heavy leather travel bag was sitting in the middle of our bedroom floor. I walked over to move it onto the luggage rack. As I lifted the heavy leather handles, a metallic clink echoed from the bottom of the bag. My fingers grazed a hidden, recessed zipper completely concealed beneath the inner lining. I paused, glancing quickly at the closed bathroom door. The water was still running loudly. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled the zipper back. Inside the hidden compartment, wrapped in a generic hotel laundry bag, was a cheap, black prepaid burner phone. Underneath the phone was a folded, heavily creased piece of thick paper. My hands were visibly shaking as I unfolded the document. It was the signature page of a residential lease agreement. The ink was fresh. I stared at the physical evidence, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. The printed address was located in a quiet, affluent suburb of Portland, Oregon. The signatures at the bottom of the page belonged to Chloe and a man named Thomas Vance. I touched the ink, feeling the slight indentation of the pen on the thick paper. It was tangible, undeniable proof of a secondary life. I quickly pulled out my own phone and snapped 3 clear, high-resolution photos of the document. I folded the paper exactly along its original creases, placed it back into the hidden compartment, and zipped the lining shut. I moved the leather bag to the luggage rack just as the shower water abruptly turned off. I sat on the edge of our mattress, my blood running completely cold. I closed my eyes as the bathroom door finally opened behind my back. I spent the entire next day locked inside my architectural office. I ignored my clients and my drafting software. Instead, I turned my massive dual monitors into a sprawling digital investigation board. I used my detail-oriented skills to map out every single piece of physical data I could find. I pulled up the Portland address from the photograph of the lease agreement. It was a beautiful, three-bedroom suburban house located near a highly rated elementary school. Then, I logged into our joint bank accounts and downloaded 18 months of credit card statements. I cross-referenced every single gas station purchase, every toll booth charge, and every grocery store transaction. The geography perfectly aligned. Every single time Chloe claimed she was flying to Seattle or Denver for a 3-day strategy conference, the gas receipts mapped a direct, 3-hour driving route straight down the interstate to Portland. She wasn't flying anywhere. She was driving to her second life. The paranoia morphed into a sickening, calculated rage. I traced the pattern backward, realizing this hadn't started a few months ago. The transactions in Portland stretched back over 5 years. 5 years of lies. 5 years of kissing me goodbye in our driveway, only to drive directly into the arms of another man. The physical evidence was overwhelming and brutally precise. I printed out the spreadsheets, the maps, and the photos of the lease, placing the heavy stack of papers into a locked drawer in my desk. I felt like I was physically suffocating inside my own office. My wife of 10 years was a ghost, a master illusionist who had completely compartmentalized her existence. The lavish vow renewal wasn't a celebration of our marriage at all. It was a desperate, expensive smokescreen to cover her tracks. I sat alone in my dark office, staring blindly at the locked drawer. The rehearsal dinner was held the night before the ceremony at a high-end downtown steakhouse. The private room was gorgeous, lined with dark mahogany and glowing crystal chandeliers. But the family dynamic inside the room was entirely rotting from the inside out. My brother, Dave, sat next to me, laughing and drinking an expensive scotch, completely unaware of the absolute nightmare I was living in. Chloe was working the room flawlessly, wearing a stunning black cocktail dress, hugging my relatives and flashing her brilliant, practiced smile. But Helen was falling apart. She sat at the corner of the table, isolating herself and drinking heavy, dark wine with a terrifying urgency. As the waiters cleared the dinner plates, the room quieted down for the traditional toasts. Dave gave a funny, heartfelt speech about my stubbornness and loyalty. Then, Helen slowly pushed her chair back. The heavy wood scraped loudly against the marble floor. She stood up, swaying slightly, her knuckles gripping the stem of her wine glass until they turned white. She stared directly across the table at Chloe. "To my beautiful daughter," Helen said, her voice thick and slurred, yet dripping with absolute venom. "You are truly remarkable. The way you manage to balance everything. The way you effortlessly juggle so many responsibilities. It's almost like you're living two entirely different lives." The silence in the room became incredibly dense and suffocating. Chloe's flawless smile instantly vanished. Her face drained of all color, and her hands began to shake violently under the table. She quickly stood up, grabbing her mother's arm with a panicked, desperate grip, and forcefully guided the older woman out into the restaurant hallway. I watched them leave, feeling the heavy burden of the truth pressing down on my chest. I sat perfectly still, knowing the final, devastating explosion was finally coming for us. I woke up on the morning of the vow renewal feeling entirely dead inside. The house was quiet. Chloe had left early for her hair and makeup appointments, leaving a sweet, handwritten note on the kitchen counter next to the espresso machine. I stared at her elegant handwriting, feeling a sharp wave of physical nausea. I walked into the master bedroom and put on my tailored black tuxedo. I stood perfectly still in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting my bow tie. In my right pocket, I held the dead, black burner phone I had stolen from her bag before she woke up. I gripped the cheap plastic casing, feeling the sharp edges pressing painfully into my palm. I faced a brutal, agonizing moral choice. I could confront her right now in the privacy of the bridal suite, hand her the dead phone, and quietly cancel the entire event. I could spare my family the public humiliation and handle the divorce behind closed doors. But as I looked at my reflection, I realized I didn't want to protect her anymore. I had spent 10 years trusting a complete stranger. If I confronted her privately, she would spin another flawless web of lies. She would gaslight me, cry, and manipulate the narrative until I doubted my own sanity. I needed the destruction to be absolute and undeniable. I took the burner phone out of my pocket and locked it inside my personal safe. I chose silence. I walked out to my car, gripping the leather steering wheel tightly, and drove toward the botanical garden. I was walking directly into a burning building, but I refused to let her escape the flames. I parked my car, adjusted my cuffs, and walked toward the meticulously arranged white chairs. The sensory details of the botanical garden were overwhelmingly beautiful and deeply sickening. The afternoon sun filtered perfectly through the massive, ancient oak trees. A professional string quartet was playing a soft, classical melody near the stone fountain. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive catering. 200 of our closest friends and family members were seated in the pristine white wooden chairs, whispering happily and holding small glasses of champagne. I stood at the front of the altar, feeling the heavy fabric of my tuxedo jacket pressing against my shoulders. My brother, Dave, stepped up beside me. He clapped a heavy, reassuring hand onto my shoulder. "You look good, man," Dave whispered, grinning widely. 10 years down, 50 more to go. I forced myself to nod, my jaw locked so tight my teeth physically ached. And then, the music shifted. The guests collectively stood up, turning toward the back of the manicured lawn. Chloe appeared at the end of the long floral runner. She looked absolutely breathtaking. The sunlight caught the intricate lacework of her custom gown. She held a massive bouquet of white roses, her eyes locked onto mine with an expression of pure, radiant love. The sickening contrast between her angelic appearance and the rotting decay of her actual life made me want to physically scream. She glided down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the stone path. She reached the altar and handed her bouquet to her bridesmaid. She took both of my hands in hers. Her skin was incredibly warm, and her grip was firm and steady. She smiled up at me, entirely convinced she had won the ultimate game of deception. But I wasn't looking at her face. I was watching her mother step forward. The officiant, a kind, older man with a soft voice, stepped up to the wooden podium. He smiled warmly at the crowd, adjusting his reading glasses. "Welcome, family and friends," he began, his voice echoing clearly through the outdoor speakers. "We are gathered here today to celebrate a decade of unwavering love and commitment between Mark and Chloe." He read a short, beautiful passage about trust and endurance. Chloe squeezed my hands, tears of seemingly genuine emotion pooling in her eyes. I stared blankly at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The officiant then lowered his script. "Before Mark and Chloe exchange their renewed vows, they have asked Chloe's mother, Helen, to step forward and offer a family blessing." The crowd clapped politely. Helen stood up from the front row. She was wearing a dark, heavy navy suit that looked completely out of place in the bright summer garden. She did not carry a piece of paper. She walked up the stone steps, her face entirely devoid of color, and took her place behind the podium. She refused the script the officiant offered her. She grabbed the microphone with both hands, gripping the metal so tightly her knuckles popped. She looked directly at Chloe, her eyes blazing with a mixture of profound sorrow and absolute rage. Then, she slowly turned her head and locked eyes with me. The sharp feedback from the speakers shrieked through the garden, cutting the tension like a physical blade. The string quartet stopped playing. The entire crowd went dead silent, sensing the sudden, terrifying shift in the atmosphere. The heavy silence hung over the manicured lawn like a suffocating blanket. Helen took a deep, jagged breath and leaned directly into the microphone to speak. "I cannot give this marriage a blessing." Helen's voice boomed through the speakers, cold and methodical. The collective gasp from 200 guests sounded like the air being sucked out of the entire garden. Chloe physically recoiled, dropping my hands as if they had suddenly caught fire. "Mom," Chloe hissed, her voice panicked and desperate. "Stop it. Sit down right now." Helen completely ignored her. She kept her steely gaze locked entirely on me. "You are a good man, Mark," Helen said, her voice echoing off the stone walls of the fountain. "You work hard. You are loyal. And you do not deserve to be the victim of a 10-year lie." Helen reached into the deep pocket of her navy blazer, and pulled out the thick, battered manila envelope. My daughter travels for work 15 days a month, Helen continued, her voice rising in volume and intensity. But she isn't in Seattle. She isn't in Denver. She is living in Portland, Oregon. She is living with a man named Thomas Vance. Chloe screamed, lunging forward, but the officiant physically blocked her path. The crowd erupted into chaotic whispers. Helen didn't stop. She methodically detonated the final, nuclear bomb right at the altar. She isn't just living with him, Helen yelled, her voice breaking with raw, agonizing emotion. She has been engaged to him for 2 years, and they share a 5-year-old son named Leo. She has an entire secret family 3 hours away. Helen stepped away from the podium, ignoring her screaming daughter, and walked directly toward me. She shoved the heavy manila envelope hard against my chest. I stared at the thick paper, my ears ringing violently as my world shattered. I stood frozen, gripping the heavy envelope as the reality of Helen's words crashed into me. Chloe was screaming hysterically now, desperately trying to grab the microphone from the shocked officiant. I didn't look at her. I simply pulled the metal clasp back and opened the envelope right there at the altar. I pulled out a thick stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs. It was physical, undeniable proof. The texture of the photos felt heavy and slick against my sweating palms. The top photo showed Chloe sitting on a suburban porch in Portland, laughing, holding a small boy with her exact same eyes. The next photo showed her kissing a tall man with dark hair, wearing a diamond engagement ring that I had never seen before. There were printed bank statements showing massive cash transfers to an account under Thomas Vance's name. There were copies of pediatric dental bills for a child named Leo, paid directly from Chloe's secret credit card. It was an entire, fully funded alternate reality meticulously documented on paper. I held the photos up, staring at the face of the little boy who looked exactly like my wife. "Mark, don't look at those," Chloe shrieked, finally shoving past the officiant. She lunged at me, her manicured nails clawing desperately at the photographs in my hands. "They are fake. She's crazy. She's trying to ruin us," she screamed, her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly desperation. She managed to snatch 2 of the photos, tearing the glossy paper in half as she fell onto her knees on the stone path. I looked down at her, watching the beautiful illusion violently bleed out onto the grass. She sobbed wildly, clutching the ripped pieces of physical evidence against her expensive silk gown. Complete chaos engulfed the beautiful botanical garden. Guests were standing up, shouting, and gasping in utter horror. Several chairs were knocked over, clattering loudly against the stone pathways. Chloe was still on her knees, desperately trying to piece the torn photographs back together while sobbing hysterically. Helen stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, weeping silently as she watched the destruction of her own daughter. Chloe suddenly scrambled to her feet and lunged toward me again, her hands reaching for my tuxedo jacket. "Mark, please let me explain. I can fix this," she screamed, her voice cracking. Before her hands could even touch my lapels, my brother, Dave, violently inserted himself between us. He shoved his massive shoulder forward, physically blocking her path. "Do not touch him," Dave growled, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. He grabbed my arm, his grip acting as the only physical anchor keeping me standing. I looked past Dave's shoulder, staring at the woman I had slept next to for 10 years. She was a complete stranger, a monster wearing my wife's face. I didn't yell. I didn't curse at her. I simply reached down, grabbed my left hand, and twisted the heavy gold wedding band off my finger. The metal felt hot and suffocating. I dropped the heavy ring onto the manicured grass right in front of her muddy shoes. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. I turned my back on the altar, ignoring the screaming, the crying, and the complete collapse of my life. I walked down the white floral runner with Dave right beside me, leaving her alone in the ruins. I didn't look back as I walked straight out of the massive iron garden gates. The days that followed were a brutal, blinding blur of cold legal action. I never returned to our marital home. I moved straight into a sterile, furnished apartment and hired the most aggressive divorce attorney I could find in the city. Using the burner phone, I tracked down Thomas Vance in Portland. I called him from my lawyer's heavy mahogany conference table. The conversation was agonizing. Thomas was completely clueless. He had been told that Chloe was a high-level executive who traveled to our city for work. He had no idea she had a husband of 10 years. The revelation absolutely broke him. The legal dismantling of our marriage was rapid and merciless. With the physical evidence Helen had provided and my own digital backups of the hidden lease agreements, Chloe had absolutely zero leverage. During the mandatory mediation sessions, she sat across the glaring wooden table, looking exhausted and utterly defeated. She tried to blame her actions on childhood trauma, claiming she had compartmentalized her life because she was terrified of true intimacy. She cried, begging me to understand the pressure she was under to maintain two perfect households. I sat there perfectly still, listening to the hollow echo of her excuses bouncing off the conference room walls. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a deep, overwhelming disgust. I demanded the sale of our suburban house and forced her to assume the $40,000 debt for the ruined vow renewal. She signed the divorce papers with a shaking hand, the pen scratching loudly against the thick legal documents. I took my copy of the settlement, stood up from the heavy leather chair, and walked out. I left the conference room without saying a single goodbye to the stranger inside. The dust has finally settled. I sit in the quietness of my new apartment, listening to the rain hit the glass windows. The space is small, but the foundation is solid, built entirely on truth. I haven't spoken to Chloe since the day she signed the divorce papers, and I never will again. I did, however, send a massive floral arrangement to Helen with a simple card that read, "Thank you for my life." It is a strange, agonizing reality to owe a debt of deep gratitude to the exact woman who completely ruined your wedding day. But Helen didn't ruin my life at the altar. She saved me from living inside a permanent, toxic illusion. Looking back, I realize how easily we ignore the small, physical inconsistencies when we desperately want to believe in the perfect picture. We smooth over the glitches, ignore the wrong receipts, and accept the fluid lies because the truth is too terrifying to confront. If you are ever faced with that agonizing doubt, my advice is simple. Trust the physical evidence over the sweet words. Look at the bank statements, read the lease agreements, and pay attention to the locked zippers hidden in the heavy luggage. Do not let someone gaslight you into doubting your own reality. It takes immense strength to stand at the altar of your own life and watch it burn completely to the ground. But once the smoke finally clears, you realize that the ashes are the only place where you can actually begin to build a structurally sound foundation. Sometimes, the most brutal truth is the only thing that can truly set you free.